There are forces of good and forces of evil at work in the world today. What are these forces? Who is responsible for the good? And who is responsible for the evil? Richard Shoff talks about current events which are rarely discussed by the mainstream media, events that affect us all. This program seeks to identify, to inform, and to equip the believer for what's ahead. Welcome to What in the World is Going On?
I'm your host, Richard Shoff. The program is sponsored by Lincoln Log Homes. We are pro-Christian, pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, pro-American, and here only by the grace of God. I want to talk today about the situation with General Milley. I don't like the original source. It's a book written by Bob Woodward. I'm old enough, I remember the hatchet job that Bob Woodward did on President Nixon many, many years ago. I don't think he's a credible source. But much of what's been exposed and brought to the forefront is being done by Tucker Carlson of Fox News. I think Tucker Carlson is one of the more reasonable and objective and honest commentators that we have today. General Milley is scheduled to come before a congressional hearing, both houses. It's interesting to how that is going to turn out, whether it is credible or not, whether it looks like he's lying or not, and what action they take. But there's a lot of smoke there, folks. We certainly got to take a look at it. Tucker Carlson unleashed one of the darkest monologues ever on the dangerous state of democracy in this country. We almost never use the term deep state on this show, Tucker Carlson let in. There's something about it that sounds paranoid, even a little nutty. As of just a few years ago, you mostly heard the phrase from relics of the far left, the kind of people who lecture you about the United Fruit Company and their toppling of governments. The term then and now suggests that our democracy is fake. Elections and domestic policies are just a sideshow. No matter who you vote for, in the end, the same people will still run everything. That is a pretty dark understanding of the American system. A quote from Tucker Carlson. Continuing to quote him, "If you are a normal person who grew up here, it is the last thing you want to believe about your own country. It seems crazy." Then you read stories like this one, Tucker said. According to reporting this summer, in the days after last November's election, Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, held a meeting with senior military officials at the Pentagon. Milley wanted to inform them of what he described as a serious threat to national security, a threat so grave it imperiled, quote, the stability of the republic. That threat, Milley said, was the sitting president of the United States. Donald Trump had dared to question the election results. For this, Milley explained the U.S. military might be required to use physical force against the President of the United States. "We're the guys with guns," Milley said. Apparently, he'd been preparing for this moment, Tucker added. Milley had had conversations with the head of the CIA, Gina Haspel, and the NSA, Paul Nicholson. He'd also spoken directly to Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, Donald Trump's chief political rivals. Now, according to this new book by Bob Woodward and Bob Costa, Milley apparently went even further than that. On October 30th of last year, Woodward and Costa report, Milley called his counterpart in China. That's a general called General Lee. Milley did not tell his boss, the president, about his call either before he made it or after. This is a quote from Tucker Carlson. Here was Milley's message for the Chinese military. "General Lee, I want to assure you the American government is stable and everything is going to be okay. We're not going to attack or conduct any kinetic operations against you." And then, reportedly, Milley said this, "General Lee, you and I have known each other for 5 years. If we are going to attack, I'm going to call you ahead of time. It is not going to be a surprise." Folks, let that sink in. If we're going to attack, I'm going to call you ahead of time. It's not going to be a surprise, Tucker pointed out. So according to this account, our country's top defense official secretly colluded with the chief military rival to undercut the President of the United States. How would you describe it? Deep state is not strong enough. That's treason. It's a crime. And apparently, Mark Milley is not the only person who was implicated in the crime. Others knew what was coming and what was happening, as he did. Our intelligence agency almost certainly heard Mark Milley's call. If they can read emails from a cable news show on Fox, what were the chances of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was speaking to a senior Chinese general, and what were they saying? Tucker added. Chances are about 100%, and yet the NSA did nothing about it. The CIA, meanwhile, was clearly fully on board with this. We're on our way to a right-wing coup, said Gina Haspel. She told Milley that, I quote, in fact, there was a coup in progress, but it didn't come from the right. A quote from Tucker Carlson. It wasn't brewing in Alabama, he said, and still a constellation of unelected government employees loyal above all to the Democrat Party and to the permanent class in Washington ignored the United States Constitution. And then they invalidated the votes of tens of millions of American citizens. How'd they do that? Because they invalidated democracy, pointed out Tucker. Democracy doesn't mean anything if the people you elect have no power. And Mark Milley did his best to make certain the elected president had no power. In early January, Woodward and Bob Costa reported Milley called another meeting with senior officials at the National Military Command Center. He informed this group that they were reported to him, not to the elected President of the United States. And that is not a small claim to make. The National Military Command Center controls, among other things, the nuclear weapons inside our missile silos, as well as the nuclear weapons on board our submarines. Mark Milley was seizing personal control of the American nuclear arsenal, he noted. He ran around and demanded that officers submit to his authority, not the president's. Milley told them to follow no orders without first consulting him. According to Woodward and Costa, all present in the room agreed to this. So civilian control of the military was over. Mark Milley was in charge, Tucker added. If this is true, it's one of the scariest things that has ever happened in this country. You often hear people say they're worried about authoritarians coming to America. Well, it's here, he said. That's what this is. It is authoritarian government. It is government by unelected, unaccountable leaders who are willing to use violence to preserve their power. This is what this book describes. It's shocking, Tucker continued. Not surprising, our news media have spent the day celebrating it. It turns out the self-described defenders of democracy don't really believe in the system they claim to revere. The idea of giving voters power over their own government, it repulses people like this. So they're relieved to discover that, in fact, our democracy is fake, and then demonstrated that the majority of those who work in the news media, indeed, are enemies of the people. You know, folks, well, let me just bottom line it. You know, America can't survive treason from within. Our U.S. lawmakers, though, are demanding Article 15.6 investigation of General Milley. Got an article, just a few days ago from Kyle Becker, and I'm going to reference it with the following. He notes that when U.S. lawmakers are demanding that the Pentagon open an Article 15.6 investigation into the actions of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that's General Mark Milley, they're doing this for reported conduct suggesting he committed high treason. The Department of Defense was notified of the lawmakers' demand for an investigation into General Milley's activities prior to the November election and then again after the January 6th riot. General Milley's activities both prior to the November election and then after the January 6th riot, two different times. Milley essentially confirmed this in a statement that he twice contacted Chinese General Li, which follows reporting from Woodward and Costa in their forthcoming book. Again, I question personally, me talking, the credibility of anything Bob Woodward writes. But the fact that Tucker Carlson is bringing this to our attention gives it some credibility, in my opinion. This book relates that Milley promised the Chinese general that he would give the Communist Party a heads up if the United States intended to attack them under the Commander-in-Chief Donald Trump. The second call Milley made to General Li on January 8th was unauthorized, according to former Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller. The letter to the Pentagon, signed by 27 members of the House of Representatives, it said, and I quote, "We are gravely concerned with General Mark Milley's ability to exercise his duties and responsibilities as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In this recent case, our specific concern involved reports from 14 September 21, which indicate that General Milley blatantly disregarded the concept of civilian control of the military and gave aid and comfort to America's principal adversary, the Chinese Communist Party." This, the 27 House members all agreed to. They wrote, and I continue, "We request a formal AR-15-6 investigation commence immediately with regard to these allegations." The demand for an investigation was spearheaded by Representative Scott Perry from Pennsylvania. He has a background with more than 38 years of U.S. Army service. He provided the Daily Caller with a statement on his rationale for the investigation of General Milley. He said, and I quote, "It is said a nation can survive its fools, but it can't survive treason from within. Sadly for America, we're infested with both, and it's time to start cleaning house before it's too late." A quote from Congressman Perry. He continued, and I'm quoting, "No matter how many stars are on your shoulders, you're never above your oath to support and defend the Constitution, and all those who break it must be held accountable. This investigation will ensure the truth is told and oaths have been upheld." Incidentally, President Biden said that he has great confidence in General Milley, despite the reports of his actions that would amount to high treason. General Milley has denied wrongdoing and is claiming that his phone calls amount to routine discussions between military leaders. I want to just interject here that yes, it was President Trump that appointed Milley. He has since said it was a mistake and he should be gone. And the fact that Biden keeps him after trying to get rid of everything that Trump had anything to do with makes me really wonder if Trump isn't right now. We know the history on foreign affairs of our current president, don't we? A related article on our topic today, retired Rear Admiral and former Trump physician, Representative Ronnie Jackson. He represents Texas' 13th District. He calls for white rage woke General Milley to be fired and prosecuted. In a scathing tweet, retired Rear Admiral and former Trump personal physician Ronnie Jackson, who I said represents Texas' 13th District in the House of Representatives, asked rhetorically whether the White House even realizes the implication of what Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark Milley allegedly pledged to divulge to China. Jackson asserted that Milley was, quote, "willing to put the lives of America's sons and daughters in extreme risk, all to undermine Trump." Jackson concluded the tweet by calling Milley a traitor and calling for him to be fired and prosecuted for treason. As Major General Paul Valley, he's U.S. Army retired, said in a recent MAGA Institute podcast, treason isn't applicable under the Constitution, as no state of war exists with China. However, General Valley continued, there are several articles under the Uniform Code of Military Justice under which Milley and possibly Secretary of Defense Austin and former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper by virtue of having themselves been officers, could also be prosecuted. Legalism aside, it is highly encouraging that a sitting member of Congress has publicly called for Milley's dismissal and prosecution. According to Major General Valley, it falls to Congress to force the Pentagon to initiate an Article 15 investigation and to convene a court-martial for Milley. We need to elect courageous Republican representatives in the House. We, that's you and me, folks, we need to let them know that we have their backs when they speak out, and that we demand that both Milley, accountable for his despicable undermining of civilian control of the military, contact, folks, your representative and let him or her know where you stand. They do record how many people are for an issue and against an issue. That's a matter of record. And that means, folks, our voices do count. And former senior official noted this: Milley had pattern of behavior of exceeding his authority and undermining Trump. A former assistant secretary to the Army under President Trump, E. Casey Wardensky, is accusing Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley of overstepping his authority and undermining President Donald Trump. Wardensky also alleged the Chief of Staff of the Army, James McConnell, did the same thing. We've been reporting how Milley allegedly contacted the Chinese and told them that he would give them a heads up if we had any plans to attack them. Well, he also intervened in the nuclear command authority of Trump by telling officers that they should not listen to anything unless it come through him. What was that? A breach of his authority. Why? Because he had no operational command authority. He did that after being pushed by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in what amounted to her trying to overthrow the constitutional authority of the elected President of the United States. Think about it, folks. Wardensky also said that this was just one instance of a pattern of behavior. These kind of behaviors and this willingness for military leaders to exceed their authority and ignore authority of the civilian officials appointed over them, positions under the Constitution and laws of this country, was not something that came to them on January 8th. Wardensky said it was something they had done for a while. According to Wardensky, there were stunning instances in which he saw firsthand high-ranking military officials exceed their authority. It was in and around the riots of D.C., he noted. General Milley, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, first thing to know, he is a staff officer. He is an advisor. But folks, he is not a commander. And he ordered elements of the 82nd Airborne and the 10th Mountain Division to fly overnight to D.C., to Fort Belvoir and Andrews without consulting the Army chain of command and reaching around the chain of command to do that. And he said, I know that for a fact. Wardensky said McConville told him that he would not be obeying any illegal orders from the president. And several violent riots across the nation in the summer of 2020, particularly in D.C. Did you hear those words? That he said indicated that our president could give an illegal order. That's not something in 30 years of service in that uniform I thought I'd ever heard, Wardensky said. My interpretation of that was he was talking about any issue of the Insurrection Act by the president. What's the Insurrection Act? That's an act of 1807 that allows a president to deploy U.S. militarized forces and National Guard troops should there be extreme civil disobedience or an insurrection. You know, we had a lot of talk about governors and mayors not enforcing the law yet, providing context to the nature of ongoing events at the time. Well, a lot of Secret Service agents were hurt at the White House. A lot of National Guardsmen were hurt at the White House. At one point, it was reported they evacuated the president to the Emergency Operations Center. And of course, Milley ordered these two units flown to D.C. Wardensky said that McConnell repeated that he would, quote, not obey illegal orders from the president. When was that? In October of 2020, which prompted Wardinsky to call his lawyer, the number 3 attorney for the Army at that time, to advise him as to what was going on and saying he was concerned that they would refuse an order of the president in regard to the Insurrection Act. My impression is, he noted, for some time, these people had no intention of supporting the president. Milley in staff meetings was routinely a bully. He would sit at the head of the table with the secretary. The secretary would say, "We're going to do the following," and Milley would look at the gathered staff and tell him, quote, "Let me tell you what the secretary just said," and it was pretty much something different. Wardinsky also noted that Milley, who he was around when he was around multiple times for meetings, went into his portfolio multiple times without prior approval. He reached into my portfolio at least 3 times without my authority and then came to me for a sort of forgiveness afterwards. Incidentally, he did not get it. Wardinsky said of Milley, he is a manipulator. Wardinsky said Milley's business with the nuclear weapons and the nuclear command and control is part of a pattern of behavior. I believe it reached at least across the top of the Army and military leadership. Milley has already said he thought his contacts with the Chinese were normal, and with his spokesman saying he had a regular contact with them. So Wardinsky raises even more questions about how long all of this had been going on and where else Milley may have exceeded his authority, not to mention how many other people were acting this way. Folks, I'm going to repeat this. General Milley is going to appear before both the Senate and the House in the near future. I think that will reveal a lot. Again, I want to point out, I do not like using anything that Bob Woodward uses on a legitimate investigation. I remember what a hatchet job he did on a very worthy president, President Nixon. But this is something that Tucker has championed, and I've got a lot of respect for Tucker. My personal belief is we need to watch what happens. Keep an open mind. But folks, where there's this much smoke, there's got to be some fire. Goodbye until next week.